In January 2021, in Tucson, Arizona, PaperWorks, the Sonoran collective for paper and book artists, kicked off its 20th anniversary year with a studio and home gallery tour with its founder, Mabel Dean. Please join us as we get to know Mabel, learn more about her work and her history, and hear about the founding of PaperWorks in Tucson.
Mabel, I understand you were involved with the female press. You're one of the people that started it. Tell us about it.
That's right. That's very interesting. When I first retired, I got involved in doing calligraphy, and I went I retired in 1993, and I went to a calligraphy conference in 1994 where I learned about many things, but I took a bookmaking class with a woman named Susan King, who is a very famous book artist. She was one of the beginners of the book arts movement back in the 90s. And she even was connected with Judy Chicago. And she taught us, there were 12 of us in the class, she taught us about developing ideas for artists' books. And she gave us very provocative assignments. And one of the assignments was to make a pocket museum. Now, what is a pocket museum? A pocket museum is a collection that you can carry in your pocket. So we were all challenged with that, and my solution to the pocket museum was to create a little book of heads, and I called it the Talking Head. And on one side of a head, you know how you argue with yourself, like, here's one, I love being an artist. The back of it is the negative talk, get a real job. And I passed a head out to everybody in the class and asked them to help me with the text for my pocket museum. And this is what we came up with, was a book of 12 different head talks. And at the end of the class, everybody said, gee, we should make that book. We should publish it. And one of the women worked at Otis College, and she offered to do the printing of it. Another one offered to do the calligraphy. And so a year later, at the next calligraphy conference, we had 180 books ready to sell.
Wow.
And we sold them all over a period of 2 or 3 years. And because we had to communicate via the mail, we called ourselves the Female Press. And we had so much fun making that book a reality that we decided we wanted to get together every year and do a book. And we did that for 10 years. One of my favorites was our second book called Pandoras Box. And it's a book of addictions and negativities. And there's a book on lies and a book on passion. And my book was a book of addictions. And you'll notice there's a head here that spins. And then there are legs, and each of the legs is a typical addiction. I drink and drink and drink, but I'm thirsty. I sniff and snort and shoot, but I can't stay high. I work and work and work, but I'm never finished. I run and run and run, but I don't get anywhere. I shop and shop and shop, but I don't have what I need. I eat and eat and eat, but I'm hungry. And this book was very well received by counselors who are working with addicts, different forms of addiction. And I made an edition of 92 books that are all gone. This is the Humble Bow, and it's a collection of sayings that we created using the breath to take something that's negative and turn it into something that's positive. For example, breathe in broken promises, breathe out waves lapping the shore. Another one, breathe, let's see here. Breathe in a forest stripped bare, breathe out the ability to share. And it's a way of dealing with the mind and calming the mind. And I thought it was a wonderful way for our 9th book to be this particular healing type of book. And it's papers that are and a polymer clay bead on the edge of it. Our final book was done in 2004, and it's a summary. We only made an edition of 10, a summary of our work. Each artist in the group did a chapter on how they had approached this, and we called From the Talking Head to the Humble Bow. And inside are pictures of the artist. We have some foldouts here. Let's see if I can find one of the work. This is some of my work, the talking head. And we had a spread for each artist and the work that they had done and who was the coordinator. Every book had its own special coordinator. One of the real fun things about the Female Press is we would meet together once a year to plan our next book and to review the book that we had finished. And we would go to Oceanside, California, and we would spend 3 days. We rented an apartment that would take had enough beds for all of us, and we would eat together and brainstorm and do exercises to decide on what our next book would be. And it was such a fellowship, a sorority, a really special group of women that to this day I still treasure my friendship. When I moved here to Tucson and got involved in the Calligraphy Guild, I also learned a little bit about book arts and decided that this was something that I was very interested in. And a little group of us in the Calligraphy Guild started meeting regularly to have, like once a month, to learn about book forms. And we would take turns teaching each other book forms. Sound familiar? Meetups. They are now known as Meetups. And it started out with like 6 or 7 people. Joyce Brodsky was one of the members who came regularly. And over the years, this group grew. I started teaching at Pima College and Extended University on how to make books, and people from the classes wanted to join some kind of a study group. And there were more and more people that wanted to participate, and we were meeting in people's homes, and there was no room to have 15 or 20 people coming once a month to study book arts. So I decided maybe I'd try to find out if there was enough interest to create another organization. I was active in the Watercolor Guild and the Calligraphy Guild and the CASA group. And I didn't know whether there was room for some kind of a book arts group. But I decided to find out. So I put out a call to artists with a flyer that I put at places like Sarnoff and Michael's and places where people go to buy art supplies. And I also took it to meetings of the Watercolor Guild and the CASA group, letting them know that we were interested in forming this organization. And I went to the Fifth Street Art Center, which didn't have a long life. It was in the old Y, and asked them if they would give me a room for free to do an organization meeting, and then we'd start meeting there if there was interest, and they agreed. So that was the very beginning of PaperWorks, because we did the call to artists. We had about 30 people show up for the initial meeting, and we sat down and brainstormed what kind of an organization we would like. And then we met a second time and passed the hat, and people put money in to help pay for the room. And people volunteered to help set up an organization. And some of the people that were there involved in that were Vanessa Deering and Kurt Dornberg and Connie Kansela, people that are still very active in PaperWorks. But that was the beginning. One of the groups that we drew membership from was the Teabag group, the Tucson Book Arts Study Group that was meeting in people's homes. And I would say every one of those people were involved in helping to make PaperWorks come to fruition. When we started to try to define what kind of an organization do we want, we wanted it to be a lot like Teabag, where we could meet together and do projects and stimulate each other. And we didn't think so much about the traditional organizational setup. We wanted study groups. We wanted to bring big names in to teach us. And we wanted many opportunities to learn from each other. I had a vision of it in the back of my head that was based on the Santa Fe Book Arts group that my sister was involved in. And they had an organization that had study groups and opportunities for people to teach each other. So that became one of the very unique things that makes PaperWorks what it is today. Phrase I just recently started calling things hand art. The older I get, the smaller I work, because I just don't want to handle big things. So hand art is stuff that you can make and that's meant to be touched. Books are a form of hand art, actually. So now I take little scraps of paper and I embellish them. And I keep this basket full of embellished little pieces of stuff. And then when I need to write a thank you note or a letter, I take one of these and write it on the back. I just did a whole bunch of them yesterday for thank yous for Christmas. So my supply is depleted. But the way I do this is kind of fun too. I have a bag of scrap here, a whole bunch of scrap that I put in one of these plastic boxes. And this becomes my raw material. I also have stamps and such. And I use them on project trays. They're all laid out and stacked up. These are in process. And sometimes it takes me days to finish a particular one. I'll just start playing around and seeing what goes on what. And I arrange and rearrange and rearrange until I get something that I like. None of these are finished because none of them are quite up to snuff. This one's getting a little closer. And then I glue them, and then they're ready to go. My favorite tool for doing this of all of them is a corner rounder. I don't know whether you have corner rounders, but I love round corners. And this other corner rounder is a standby for my hand art and my thank you notes. It's a lot of fun to do this. You wanted to know where the trays are coming from. A friend of mine had a connection who worked in the OR in a hospital here in town. And she would, when they were finished with the operation, she would take the trays and recycle them. And these are all recycled trays from the operating room. And they're perfect for this because you can stack and things don't move around. And they're a nice shape. They're great for all kinds of things. They're a great surface to work on when you're painting or doing jelly printing. You can have the stuff on here and then you don't get it all over your table. And coupled with one of these project binders there, it's perfect. Or not binders. I like to have some of my art out for people to touch. And this was a piece of hand art, a flower I painted, and I cut it out. And then I decided, gee, I should do something with it. And someone had sent me a quote. So I printed it out and folded the paper and made something fun to look at. This is the book I did for the traveling book. But I have other books and little interesting things, and I have them out on a table or on the fireplace in the living room so that people can touch. And it's really fun. This was a traveling book I made with a friend, and I bound it up. We took turns. We took turns sending each other in the mail these pieces of paper. We did each 3 rounds of making marks, and then this is the final output, which is really kind of fun. So these are not your usual projects, but they're my projects that make me very happy. About 10 years ago, Ed and I went up to Washington State and met a friend of mine, Carol, who was a member of the female press. And we spent 2 weeks there. We studied at Sitka Art Center. And then Carol and I did some playing around together. And she mentioned to me, my birthday was coming up, that she had a friend who made a doll on her birthday. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting idea. So that year, I made my first birthday doll. And this is her. They don't have names, but she was done in 2004. And I made her from all the materials that my sister used to wrap up my birthday presents. And so she was number 1. And then every year thereafter, I made a doll. And they have little books, some of them, about what I was grateful for that particular year. And this one I started on a plane when I was going to Washington, D.C., making the fabric about 2 weeks before my birthday. And then when I came back, I finished her. This one down here was inspired by a video of the Ethiopian people of the Id who decorate their bodies with flowers. And I showed some friends a video of that, and we got so enamored of what they did, I decided my doll would be an Ethiopian, honoring the Ethiopians. For a number of years, I went to Art Unraveled, and I taught at Art Unraveled, and I took classes at Art Unraveled. It was so much fun. And one year, I took a class from Jane LaFazio on, I think it was the year the jelly printer just came out, the jelly plates. And we did some fabric with the jelly plate. And then I made it into a little flag. So each of these little squares, that was about the size of the jelly plate, I had printed. And then I embellished them with stitches. And she was quite involved in encouraging people to make little prayer flags to put out outdoors. So I started doing prayer flags for friends of mine who needed extra prayers. And this was done for a friend, Lola. I don't remember all of who they were for now. This was done for Kurt Dornberg when Kurt had his first heart attack. You can see his heart there. This was done for Ruthie Canada, and she passed away, but I had her flag. This was done for Ed. And I have others that I've given away. I just loved making them. There's some other flags here in my studio that will be familiar to some of the PaperWorks members because I participated in that project. And I couldn't hang them in my studio all in one long stream, so I have some over each window. But this is my other hangout. This is was Ed's office. I've rearranged it a little bit and made it mine. But this is Ed's wall of photos that he was working on at the time when he passed. And what's interesting about Ed and the way he worked was he would take photographs that he liked and he would put them up on the wall and study them. He would spend hours looking at them, playing with them in his mind about how to make them the photograph he wanted them to be when they were finished. He had two challenges. In the beginning, when he started taking photographs, he wanted the photograph to be as much like the emotion he felt when he was taking the picture. So he didn't want the picture distorted in any way. He wanted it to be a really accurate representation of what he saw and the light that he saw it in. Then we went to Anderson Ranch the year before he died and took a wonderful class with a woman named Karen Devine who shot only with an iPhone. She's very well known as an iPhoneographer. And she changed him and his style of photography completely because she's a photo collage artist, and she would distort her images and play with her images and tell stories with her images. And it gave him a new way of working with his own images, changing the colors, changing the textures, but all working from a photograph and not trying to draw it or anything like it, just altering it in some fashion. And so I feel when I'm in this room that his presence is always here with me. Ed was a great photographer. Many of you knew him when he was PaperWorks treasurer. And his use of the camera inspired me in some ways to try to make books with some of his photographs. One of the pictures he took, we would go over to San Diego regularly, and he took this picture of a little boy on the beach, and I turned it into a book, and it has two sides to it. The first side says, "Soldier on, stay in line, obey your mother, don't act up." And then the back obey your father, don't act out, behave, that's a good boy. And here is the little boy marching. I thought was such an amazing photograph of his. And to turn it into a flag book, which is one of my favorite forms for a story. A little homage to Ed. Got a couple other of his books that I made into a flag. He loved to take photographs of reflections. And so I got him to print some out and made a book. I made several books of his reflections here. It goes on and on. And when it's strung out in front of the fireplace, it really looks great. Then another book of reflections. I made little maquettes of these. I don't know where they are right now. I would have showed you those instead because they were much smaller. But here's another use of photographs in a book. And it's very effective. The first photos I ever put in a book was at a workshop with a woman named Kitty Marriott. And she taught us how to do a layered book with photo transferred photos. And this is one. These are pictures I took at a parade in San Diego and layered them, which was kind of fun. It's amazing when you start thinking about photographs, what you can do in a very non-traditional way, which of course is what I'm always trying to do, is something different that nobody else has ever done before. We went to Morocco. And I used pictures of people which you were not supposed to take. But I would grab shots here and there and everywhere because the people in Morocco were so interesting to look at. And I juxtaposed those pictures with pictures of things that also intrigued me in Morocco. So here's an example. I printed all of the people pictures in black and white, and I covered them with acetate. And then I put something next to them that sort of seemed to work. So I have all of the people shots telling the story of Morocco. It's one of my favorite books travel journals that I've done. The snake charmer. She was a weaver. We got to spend a night under the stars sleeping in a tent in the middle of the Sahara Desert. We got to ride camels. And then my final picture, my final thing, was sand from I brought back some sand and put it in for the, but I thought that was an interesting way of using photographs to do a travel story, and was worthy of having a box all of its own because it's so. Travel journals intrigue me, and I've done a number of them. I have a couple that I think are particularly interesting. Here's one that I did on Venice. And again, I wanted to use some of my photographs but I didn't want it to be a book of photography. So some of these things are photographs that I have taken, and when we get back in a little bit, and then transferred and colored with watercolor. This was a black and white photograph, trimmed and applied and painted with watercolor. That was a rubbing. There's another photograph, black and white, pasted on and then painted. And I did it because I didn't have the skill to print color photos. Ed was doing that, and I wanted this to be my book. So I used the black and white, which came off the Xerox machine. But I think it turned out kind of interesting. Here's another piece that was a photograph that was colored with paper, colored with paint. And then here was a travel journal that I made. We went to Stinson Beach, and I did a little story of Stinson. This was sand from the beach that I put on paper, made my own sandpaper. And I did a painting and a poem that captured the images that were outside our beach cottage and little beach memorabilia. And then in the back, I wrote some more about what it was like to be at Stinson in the winter. This was in the middle of winter. So it's just a different kind of travel experience recorded, but that's one of the things I love about making books so much, is you're only limited by your imagination. It doesn't have to be on day one I did XYZ. I've picked some of my special books. Most of my books have never been on display because book shows want things on a particular theme, and these are books I've created for fun over the years, and they were for me and not for shows. So I would say most of what I have has never been shown, or it's on some of it might be on my website. The book, one of the first books that I ever made after coming back from that calligraphy conference was something called the Escalante Christmas Tamales. The Escalantes lived across the street from me when I lived out in the desert, and I was invited to help make Christmas tamales. So I made it into a book and gave them the story. I took all the notes, the recipes and everything, how they did it, and made this little book for them as a thank you for that. And I had never bound a book before with a hardcover. I kind of made it up as I went along. So that was one of my very, very first books, and I'm very proud of it, and I still have it. And I gave them 6 copies for the kids. It was really fun. Then I took a workshop. My sister gave me a birthday present to take a workshop with, darn, I can't think of her name. She's very well known. But anyway, it was a paste paper workshop. And we made paste papers, and then we put them into a book. And we journaled on them. And this became a model for me in a workshop that I started teaching at the Extended University of Arizona. And I called it Contemplating Spirit. And I taught it on the weekend of Day of the Dead. And it was an opportunity to paint papers motivated by our past and our future, and then journal on the books, and then bind them into these very gorgeous paste paper books. This was the first one that I ever made. I made many after that. And the people who've taken that class treasure those books because it really contains their spirit. I had them work with their very favorite colors, and I had them journal with disguised hands so they could write whatever came up from a spiritual point of view. And the second day when they were doing their writing, I made them wear their favorite outfit to class so that they were very comfortable. And some of them came in pajamas. And when they held their papers up to show the class, they were the same colors as their favorite outfits, which was such an interesting thing. Because when you start working from your inner place without editing yourself, which is what was one of the goals of those books, beautiful, wonderful things happen. That was one of my favorite classes to teach. Another book that was very important to me was this book called I Am Somebody Body. As growing up, I had many body issues and thought I was the ugliest person in the world, practically. And I worked through those issues making this particular book. It's a seminal book for me. And the person that motivated me to do this was Vanessa Deering, who gave me the covers for this book and said, make a body book. And this is what I did. And I wrote letters to people in the book. There was a woman, my mother's best friend, who told me I'd better be smart because no man would ever have me because I had such ugly legs. And that was a terrible thing to say to a 4-year-old, but I remembered it for many years. And so I wrote her a letter and told her that was a bad thing that she did. And much of this book is very autobiographical and has to deal with my body image. And it took me 5 years to finish writing these little essays and talking about things. That 7th grade, picture was taken on the day I got my period. And I hated the way I looked. I had a little ball on my nose. But over the years now, I realized she was really an awfully sweet young woman. So this book was just really very, very important to me. And I finished it, and it became the end. It did go into one show, but it really is not. It's a very personal book, just about my life. And it made a little box for it and everything. Doing things that are autobiographical are a lot of fun for me. I we did a challenge at PaperWorks, and I can't even remember what the challenge was, but the one that I did was called Unknown Legacies. And I had my mother's family on one side and my father's family on the other side, and put in here some of the things that I remember about these people that made me who I was. My mother's family was practically unknown to me, and I had this was an opportunity to explore it a little bit. But I think that's one of the exciting things about making artist books, is to take something that you want, a theme or an idea that you want to play with, and make it something that's beautiful and meaningful to you. Another one that I did was based on where I've lived. I think I've lived in 14 different places throughout my life. And so I made a long time ago envelopes are with the address of where I lived. And then in finishing this book and turning it into a book, I did realtor descriptions for each of the places that I lived in. And then I mounted them on these paste papers and then journaled about what I remember. Some I remember more vividly than others. But now what I have is a record of the places I've lived, right up to Home Street, where I live now, in this really rather attractive book. And then I put it in a bag. Bags are a lot easier to construct than boxes, and stitched on it a title. Another place that I lived was Silver City. Ed and I had a summer getaway there for a few years, and I did an altered book of things that were done. I had never done an altered book, and this was one I did when I was in Silver City, of some of the things that were meaningful while we were there. And made a box for that. I'm always looking for oddball ways of doing things, and I love paper. And we think of paper in sheets, but another thing that I've been curious about is using paper as a charm or as a token, a milagros of sorts. So this was a thing that I made of paper pieces. Maybe someday paper will become important in that fashion. But this kind of thinking led me to my little hand arts elements. One summer, Ed and I went up to the Sitka Art Center with my friend Carol Sauter, and we took classes, and then the place we stayed was very close to the sea, and so Carol and I spent 3 days doing an artist book based on where we were. So there's the sea, and these were all the things, I got it upside down, that we found at water's edge. And we called the book Ebb Tide. And we made an edition of 3. One for her, one for me, and one to give to the Art Center to put in an auction. And they declined to accept it because we weren't famous enough. They were having a fundraising, and we weren't famous artists, so they didn't want this to go into their auction. So Carol, I gave the extra one to Carol, who gave it to her daughter, who thoroughly appreciates it. I also love playing with fiber, and I've made a lot of, not a lot, but I've made things out of sewing, stitchery and such. I was a home ec teacher for a number of years, and one of the classes I took at Art Unraveled was turning making fiber beads. Now these are not the ones I made in that class, but I just think fooling around with fiber beads is fun. And here's a pin that I've made. These just need to go on strings to hang. I have some that I've done. I don't know where, I think I've given them away. Here's one that you could wear. It's just interesting to think, what can you do with a little piece of fabric and some wire or a clasp to wear to adorn yourself? Like the Ethiopians adorn themselves with flowers, we can adorn ourselves with little bits of fiber. I took one of Jane's workshops here in Tucson, and this is one of my favorite pieces that I've ever done, and it was done in that particular workshop where we journaled on fabric, and then she gave us 9 different exercises to turn the fabric into little squares, and I just love this piece. I love stitching, and I love adding layers on top of layers. Each of these squares is glazed with a layer of netting. Here's another piece that has layers of over layers, and it's just like putting a watercolor wash over a piece of fabric. To Anderson Ranch and study with Hiroki Morinoe, who is a national treasure in Hawaii, a painter, and just one of the most beautiful people I've ever met. He actually did a workshop for PaperWorks on using wood blocks, and we printed with some of his wood blocks and did some very unusual work. But before that, Ed and I went to Anderson Ranch, which is in Colorado, and it's an art school with a really wonderful summer program. And Hiroki, I was taking a watercolor class with Hiroki. It was so much fun. And now it's so much fun to look at. Interesting to note that PaperWorks, the fundamentals of PaperWorks hasn't changed at all over 20 years, that we're still very much the same kind of organization with the same mission. What's changed is that there are a lot more members than there were when we started out. On the day that we actually signed a charter, I think we had 48 people sign the charter. And now I don't know what the current membership is, but I know it floats around 200, which is amazing that there are 200 people here in Tucson that come regularly. I bet half of them come to most of the meetings. We seem to have about 80 or 90 people at a meeting to share and to fraternize and to learn. And that makes me very excited that it hasn't changed in the basic spirit, because it's an organization for learning and growing. And I can say unequivocally that watching people who have been in PaperWorks for a long period of time, I see huge growth in the sophistication and complexity and skill with which they make art. So that is one of the real blessings of PaperWorks. But another thing is, that was true for me and still is, that the main friendships that I have made in PaperWorks have stayed with me for years. My PaperWorks friends are my friends. They're the ones that I socialize with, that I learn from, that I play with. It's an organization that has become a focal point for my life. And I think it's become a focal point for many other people's lives too. You don't join PaperWorks and just participate once a year. When you join PaperWorks, you seem to get really involved quickly. And you get really involved quickly because we have great workshops. We bring fabulous people from all over the country in to teach us. We have great speakers, and the most exciting thing about our great speakers is they're all local working artists who are teaching us and sharing their particular point of view. And we don't limit it to people who work with paper. We've had sculptors, we've had oil painters, we've had all kinds of wonderful artists come and show their work and explain their process. And I find those meetings really interesting to see how other people approach their creativity and apply their creativity. And then we have so many programs that are free to people, where they are very low cost, where we have after our meetings, we have little get-togethers where people can learn things. We have meetups, all kinds of meetups covering all kinds of topics, where we can go and get together and learn from each other. And then we have the workshops taught by members, where you can sign up for. I was taking some from Nora a couple of years ago on embroidery techniques that was just wonderful. So we meet a wide variety of interests and needs and provide opportunities for people to test out new and interesting, exploring new media and new ways of creative expression. I don't think you get better than that.